Hello, my friends. Imagine a world you cannot recognize. Not a world of jungles and dinosaurs, nor even a world of silent, empty shores. Imagine instead a planet of fire, a glowing sphere of molten rock under a toxic sky, long before the first oceans ever formed. Our story begins not with a roar, but with a cosmic silence, in the deepest corridors of time. Tonight, we journey back to the very beginning, to witness the birth of our world. Our journey does not start on Earth, but in a swirling cloud of dust and gas, a cosmic nursery more than 4.5 billion years ago. Here, in the quiet chaos of the young solar system, gravity was the great sculptor. It pulled together countless tiny particles, dust grains, and pebbles, drawing them into a growing collection of matter. Over millions of years, these collisions became more violent. Asteroids and planetesimals, small rocky bodies, smashed into one another, their kinetic energy transforming into immense heat. With each impact, the growing proto-Earth became hotter, its surface a glowing, molten sea of magma. This was the Hadean Aeon, a name fittingly derived from Hades, the underworld of Greek mythology. It was a vision of hell, a world of fire and shadow, perpetually bombarded by the debris left over from the solar system's formation. The sky, if you could call it that, was not blue. It was a thick, oppressive shroud of carbon dioxide, nitrogen, and water vapour, a toxic atmosphere that would be instantly lethal to any life we know today. There was no solid ground to stand on, only the churning, bubbling surface of a lava ocean thousands of kilometres deep. The silence was absolute, broken only by the hiss of volcanic gases and the thunderous, world-shattering crack of another massive asteroid striking the molten surface, sending up brilliant, fiery splashes of liquid rock that would arc for miles before collapsing back into the glowing sea. It was during this violent, formative period that one of the most significant events in our planet's history occurred. A celestial body, a proto-planet, roughly the size of Mars, which scientists have named Theia, was on a collision course with our young Earth. It didn't just graze our planet, it was a direct, cataclysmic impact. The energy released in this single event is almost beyond human comprehension, trillions of times more powerful than all the nuclear weapons on Earth combined. Theia and a significant portion of Earth's mantle were vaporized instantly, creating a superheated cloud of rock and gas that was flung into orbit around the wounded planet. For a time, Earth may have had a ring, a shimmering band of debris, much like Saturn. But gravity, the patient sculptor, went to work again. Over thousands of years, this ring of debris began to coalesce. Particles clumped together, growing larger and larger, until they formed a single, massive sphere. This new sphere, born from the fiery crucible of this ancient collision, would become our constant companion, a silent watcher in the night sky. This is how we believe the moon was formed. Its presence would prove to be one of the most critical factors for the future of life. Its gravitational pull would stabilize Earth's wobble, preventing wild and extreme climate swings, and it would create the gentle rhythm of the tides in oceans that were yet to be born. For millions of years after this grand collision, the Earth remained a molten world, but deep within its core, a process was beginning that would change everything. Heavier elements, like iron and nickel, were sinking through the liquid magma, drawn by gravity toward the planet's centre. This great sorting of materials, known as planetary differentiation, formed Earth's dense metallic core. This process was not just a simple settling of layers, it generated even more internal heat, keeping the planet molten, but more importantly, the swirling liquid iron in the outer core would eventually create something extraordinary, a magnetic field. This invisible shield would extend far out into space, protecting the planet's surface from the harsh solar wind. A constant stream of charged particles from the sun that would otherwise strip away any atmosphere that tried to form. Without this magnetic field, Earth might have become a barren, Mars-like world, its atmosphere lost to space forever. It was an unseen, silent guardian, and its creation was a pivotal step on the path to a living world. The stage was slowly being set, but the planet was still far too hot for the next act to begin. The relentless bombardment from space began to subside. The solar system was clearing out its debris, and the giant impacts became less frequent. This allowed the Earth's surface to finally begin to cool. Over vast stretches of time, a thin crust of solid rock started to form on the surface of the magma ocean, like a skin on cooling liquid. It was a fragile, dark crust, likely basaltic in nature, constantly being fractured and remelted by the heat from below and the occasional late-arriving asteroid. Volcanoes were everywhere, piercing this thin skin, releasing more gases from the planet's interior. This process, known as outgassing, continued to build the early atmosphere. And within that atmosphere was a crucial ingredient, held in the form of steam water. The water that would one day form our oceans had been delivered to Earth by comets and asteroids during the bombardment, and it was also locked within the very minerals that made up the planet, released as water vapour by the intense volcanic activity. As the surface temperature finally dropped below the boiling point of water, a monumental event began. The thick, steamy clouds that had shrouded the planet for millions of years started to condense. The first raindrop fell, then another, and another. It was not a gentle shower. It was a torrential, planet-wide deluge that lasted for thousands, perhaps millions of years. Water poured from the sky, running over the new, black volcanic rock of the crust, pooling in the lowest lying areas, the vast basins and craters that scarred the young planet's face. These pools grew into lakes, the lakes into seas, and the seas merged to become the first global ocean. Imagine the sound of this great rain, a constant, thunderous roar across the entire planet, as hot water fell from the sky onto the warm, dark rock. There was no life to witness it, only the raw, elemental forces of geology and chemistry at play. This new ocean was not the blue, salty water we know today. It was likely acidic, from the carbon dioxide dissolved within it, and it was a brownish-green colour, rich in dissolved iron leached from the planet's crust. It was a strange, alien sea under a reddish, hazy sky. With the formation of the oceans, we transition from the fiery Hadean into the next great chapter of Earth's history, the Archean Eon. The Earth was now a water world. Small volcanic islands and the first tiny protocontinents dotted the surface of a globe-spanning ocean. These were not the large, stable continents we know today, but small, mobile land masses that were constantly forming, colliding, and being pulled back down into the mantle. The planet was still incredibly active geologically, its internal heat far greater than it is now. But in the warm, shallow waters of this ancient, iron-rich ocean, something truly remarkable was about to happen. The essential ingredients for life, carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur were all present, delivered by comets and present in the volcanic gases bubbling up from the seafloor, in hydrothermal vents, deep on the ocean floor. Hot, mineral-rich water spewed from cracks in the Earth's crust. Here, in the darkness, a complex chemistry was at work, creating a soup of organic molecules. These were not yet life, but they were the building blocks. For hundreds of millions of years, this chemical evolution continued. Simple organic molecules learned to replicate themselves, perhaps using the crystalline surfaces of clay minerals as a template. They became enclosed within simple membranes, tiny bubbles of fat called lipids, creating the first primitive cells. We do not know precisely how or when this magical threshold was crossed. The fossil record from this deep time is almost non-existent, but we know that by about 3.5 billion years ago, life was here. It was simple, single-celled, microbial life, flourishing in the absence of oxygen. These were the prokaryotes, organisms like bacteria and archaea. They were, for all intents and purposes, invisible. For more than 1 billion years, they would be the sole inhabitants of Earth. The planet would have appeared silent and barren from a distance, its continents empty, its oceans seemingly clear. But beneath the surface, a biological revolution was quietly unfolding. These tiny microbes were transforming the planet. They were the first chemists, developing new ways to harness energy from their environment. And one group, in particular, would develop a trick that would change the world forever. They were called cyanobacteria, and they had figured out how to use the energy from the sun to create their own food. The process was called photosynthesis, and it had a waste product. That waste product was oxygen, a gas that was, at the time, a deadly poison to almost every other form of life on Earth. But what did this mean for the silent, microbial world that had existed in peace for so long? A great change was coming, a change that would paint the sky blue and trigger a global catastrophe for the life that had created it. The overture was ending, and the story of life was about to truly begin. For nearly 2 billion years following the dawn of life, our planet was a world held in microbial sway. The cyanobacteria, floating in the warm, sunlit layers of the global ocean, were patiently, relentlessly performing their revolutionary chemistry. Photosynthesis, their great invention, was slowly but surely pumping free oxygen into the environment. At first, this new, highly reactive gas didn't build up in the atmosphere. Instead, it was immediately absorbed by the vast amounts of dissolved iron in the oceans. The oxygen bonded with the iron, causing it to rust, and this rust gently rained down onto the seafloor, particle by particle, over hundreds of millions of years. This process created immense deposits of iron ore, known today as banded iron formations, which are the source of most of the iron and steel we use in our modern civilization. In a very real sense, the foundations of our skyscrapers and bridges were laid down by the quiet breathing of ancient bacteria. But eventually, the iron in the oceans was all used up. There was nothing left to absorb the oxygen being produced, and so it began to escape, bubbling up out of the water and into the atmosphere for the very first time. This event, known as the Great Oxidation Event, was the first and perhaps greatest pollution crisis the world has ever known. For the anaerobic life that had dominated the planet for eons, life that had evolved in an oxygen-free world, this new gas was a lethal poison. It triggered a mass extinction, wiping out countless species of microbes. But in the face of this crisis, evolution found a new way forward. Some organisms evolved the ability to not only tolerate oxygen, but to use it. They developed a new, far more efficient way of generating energy respiration. This metabolic innovation was a turning point, providing the high-octane fuel that would be necessary for more complex, active forms of life. Around this time, another monumental step occurred. One simple cell engulfed another, but instead of digesting it, the two began to live together in a symbiotic relationship. The inner cell became what we now know as the mitochondrion, the powerhouse of the cell, an expert at using oxygen to produce energy. This was the birth of the eukaryotic cell, the complex cell type that is the basis for all animals, plants, fungi, and protists, including ourselves. Life was now armed with a powerful new cellular architecture and a high-energy fuel source. The stage was set for a new chapter. Our journey now brings us forward in time to the beginning of the Paleozoic era, roughly 541 million years ago. We have arrived in the Cambrian period. If you were to stand on the shore of a Cambrian continent, the world would feel profoundly alien. The land itself is largely barren and empty. There are no trees, no grasses, no flowers, not even any soil to speak of. The ground is a vast expanse of bare rock, sand, and gravel, perhaps with a greenish or darkish sheen of microbial mats and primitive mosses clinging to damp areas near the water's edge. The silence is immense, a deep geological quiet broken only by the wind and the rhythmic wash of waves. The air you breathe is different, too. Oxygen levels are still significantly lower than they are today, perhaps only around 12 to 15%, compared to our modern 21%. Breathing would feel like being at high altitude, leaving you constantly short of breath, and the sun's rays would feel unusually harsh and dangerous. The ozone layer, which protects us from harmful ultraviolet radiation, is still thin and not fully formed. Without protection, the sun would burn your skin in minutes. The continents themselves are unrecognizable, fragments of a recently broken up supercontinent called Rodinia, now scattered mostly in the southern hemisphere. There is Gondwana, a huge landmass that will one day become South America, Africa, Australia, and Antarctica, and there is Laurentia, the core of future North America, lying on its side near the equator. The world is a place of vast, shallow, warm seas, and it is in these seas that the real action is happening. As you step into the warm, clear water, you would witness a biological revolution in full swing. This is the event known as the Cambrian explosion. For 3 billion years, life on Earth was overwhelmingly simple and small, but here, in a geological blink of an eye, lasting perhaps only 20 million years, the oceans suddenly, miraculously, teem with an astonishing diversity of complex animal life. The seafloor, once a quiet expanse of mud and microbial mats, is now a bustling, crowded landscape of bizarre and wonderful creatures. You would see trilobites, the iconic animals of this period. They are arthropods, distant relatives of insects and crabs, scuttling across the seabed on jointed legs. Some are small scavengers, while others are larger predators, their bodies protected by a hard, segmented exoskeleton. Their complex compound eyes, among the first ever to evolve, stare out at this new, vibrant world. They are everywhere, in an incredible variety of shapes and sizes, a testament to the explosive creativity of evolution. Digging in the mud are early worms, creating burrows and turning over the sediment for the first time, a process that fundamentally changes the chemistry of the seafloor. Looming above this scene, swimming awkwardly through the water, is one of the era's top predators. This is Anomalocaris, the abnormal shrimp, growing up to 1 meter in length. It is a true giant of its time. It has large, stalked eyes, a circular mouth filled with sharp, tooth-like plates, and 2 fearsome, spiny appendages at the front of its head for grasping its prey, likely unsuspecting trilobites. It propels itself with undulating fins along the sides of its body, a formidable and terrifying hunter in this brand new world of predators and prey. The evolution of predation was a powerful engine driving the Cambrian explosion. For the first time, animals had to evolve defences, hard shells, spines, and the ability to burrow. This created an evolutionary arms race, where predators evolved better ways to hunt, and prey evolved better ways to hide or protect themselves, leading to a rapid diversification of body plans. All the major animal phyla that exist today find their origins in this single, fertile period. Creatures with the first backbones. Our own distant ancestors like Pikaia swam nervously through these waters, hoping to avoid the notice of the larger invertebrates. What could have caused this sudden burst of evolutionary innovation? Scientists are still debating the exact causes, but it was likely a perfect storm of several factors. The rising oxygen levels, a result of billions of years of photosynthesis, finally crossed a critical threshold, providing the energy needed for larger, more active bodies. The end of a global ice age, known as Snowball Earth, may have infused the oceans with a fresh supply of minerals and nutrients, fueling the base of the food web. The very geography of the world, with its many warm, shallow seas, created by the breakup of Rodinia, provided countless new ecological niches for life to fill. And perhaps most importantly, life itself had finally evolved the genetic toolkit necessary for building complex bodies, the so-called Hox genes, which act as master switches controlling the layout of an animal's body plan, were now in place. Evolution could now experiment with this toolkit, modifying it to create legs, antennae, shells, and eyes. It was a moment of unparalleled biological creativity, a time when the fundamental blueprints for the animal kingdom were drawn up. As you look around this Cambrian seascape, you would see life forms that seem to come from a science fiction story. There is Hallucigenia, a tiny, worm-like creature that walks on 7 pairs of stilt-like spines and has a row of tentacles on its back. There is Wiwaxia, covered in protective spines and scales, looking like a crawling, armoured slug. And there is Opabinia, with its 5 eyes and a long, flexible proboscis, ending in a claw, which it likely used to catch soft-bodied prey. For a long time, these creatures were so strange that scientists had no idea how to classify them, seeing them as failed evolutionary experiments. But we now understand that they represent the wild, early days of animal evolution, before life settled into the more familiar forms we know today. This was a world teeming with life, but it was also a world of great danger. Survival was a daily struggle. The low oxygen, the harsh radiation, and the new threat of predators made every moment a challenge. And yet, life was not just surviving, it was thriving, diversifying at a rate never seen before or since. The silence of the Hadean and the microbial quiet of the Archean were gone, replaced by the scuttling, swimming, and hunting of the first animal kingdom. But this explosion was just the beginning. How would these new, strange forms of life continue to evolve and shape the planet in the periods to come? The story was just getting started. Leaving the explosive creativity of the Cambrian period behind, our journey through time takes us into the next chapter of the Paleozoic era, the Ordovician, which began around 485 million years ago. The world is still largely a planet of oceans, but the continents continue their slow, inexorable dance. Gondwana, the southern supercontinent, drifts slowly towards the South Pole. Laurentia, Siberia, and Baltica remain separate landmasses, scattered across the warmer equatorial regions. The shallow sunlit seas that cover vast portions of these continents are the stage for the next great act of evolution. The groundwork laid during the Cambrian explosion now gives way to a period of incredible diversification. Life is not just experimenting with new body plans anymore, it is refining them, specializing, and building the first complex marine ecosystems. If the Cambrian was the wild, chaotic birth of animal life, the Ordovician was its coming of age. Imagine yourself floating in these Ordovician seas. The water is teeming with life, far more densely packed than in the Cambrian. The trilobites are still here, more diverse and abundant than ever. But they are no longer the undisputed rulers of the seafloor. They now share their world with a host of other creatures. You would see vast colonies of strange, stalked animals called crinoids, or sea lilies. They look like plants, with feathery arms that filter tiny food particles from the water, but they are in fact animals, related to starfish and sea urchins. Their delicate forms sway in the gentle currents, creating dense underwater meadows. Among them are the first true coral reefs. These are not built by the same types of corals we see today, but by extinct groups called tabulate and rugose corals. They create massive, intricate structures that provide shelter and habitat for countless other species, forming the first bustling cities of the ocean. Snails, clams, and lampshells are now common, their hard shells littering the seafloor. And lurking within the reef's crevices are new predators. The most formidable of these are the cephalopods, the ancient relatives of modern squid and octopuses. But unlike their soft-bodied descendants, these Ordovician cephalopods had heavy, straight, cone-shaped shells. Some, like the massive endocteras, could grow to be enormous, their shells reaching lengths of up to 6 meters. They were the apex predators of this age. Imagine the sight of one of these giants moving through the water, propelling itself backward by shooting jets of water from its body, its tentacles reaching out to grasp unsuspecting prey like trilobites. They were the submarines of the Paleozoic seas, silent, shelled hunters that dominated the food web. The arms race started in the Cambrian continued with new intensity. The trilobites evolved more elaborate spines and the ability to roll up into a defensive ball, much like a modern pill bug, to protect their soft undersides from the crushing beaks of the cephalopods. But perhaps the most significant evolutionary development in the Ordovician seas was happening among our own distant relatives, the vertebrates. During the Cambrian, our ancestors were small, soft-bodied creatures. Now they were beginning to develop true hard backbones. And more importantly, they were evolving armour. The first fish appear in the fossil record during this period. They are bizarre-looking creatures, unlike any fish alive today. They are jawless, their mouths simple openings designed for sucking up detritus from the seafloor. Their bodies are covered in thick, bony plates and scales, an evolutionary response to the constant threat of being eaten by giant sea scorpions or cephalopods. These armoured, jawless fish, known as ostracoderms, were the pioneers of the vertebrate world. They were slow and clumsy compared to the agile invertebrates, but their bony armour gave them a fighting chance, and their internal skeleton was a design that would one day allow their descendants to conquer not just the oceans, but the land as well. Meanwhile, on the barren continents, the first signs of a terrestrial invasion were beginning. For hundreds of millions of years, the land had been sterile rock. But now, the first true plants were making their way out of the water. These were not mighty trees or even small shrubs. They were tiny, non-vascular plants, similar to modern liverworts and mosses. They had no true roots or leaves, and could only survive in damp areas along the edges of the seas and freshwater streams. They formed a green fuzz on the otherwise desolate landscape. Accompanying them were the first terrestrial animals, tiny arthropods, relatives of millipedes and mites, venturing out of the water to feed on the decaying plant matter. It was a humble beginning, a tentative first step into a vast and empty world, but it was a step that would eventually lead to the great forests and diverse terrestrial ecosystems of the future. The conquest of the land had begun. However, the prosperity of the Ordovician was not destined to last. Towards the end of the period, around 444 million years ago, the planet was plunged into a catastrophic crisis. The supercontinent of Gondwana had drifted directly over the South Pole. This positioning allowed massive ice sheets to form, locking up huge quantities of the world's water. As the glaciers grew, sea levels plummeted dramatically by as much as 100 metres. The warm, shallow seas that had been the cradle of Ordovician life drained away, exposing the reefs and turning vast areas of the continental shelves into dry land. This was a devastating blow to marine ecosystems. The first wave of extinction was caused by this habitat loss and the global cooling. Then, as the Ice Age ended, the glaciers melted and sea levels rose rapidly, flooding the newly established ecosystems with cold, low oxygen water. This delivered a second deadly pulse of extinction. In total, the late Ordovician mass extinction wiped out an estimated 85% of all marine species. It was the first of the Big Five mass extinctions in Earth's history. A brutal reminder that life on our planet is subject to immense geological forces beyond its control. Out of the ashes of this extinction, life began its slow recovery, leading us into the Silurian period. The world that emerged was different. The climate warmed again, the glaciers retreated, and the seas rose to flood the continents once more. In the oceans, the survivors of the extinction radiated into the newly empty ecological niches. The giant straight-shelled cephalopods were much rarer now, their reign as apex predators coming to an end. Taking their place were the eurypterids, or sea scorpions, these formidable arthropods, some growing to over 2 meters in length, were now the terrors of the shallow seas, with powerful claws to snatch their prey. But the fish were also making a remarkable comeback. The jawless, armoured ostracoderms diversified, but a revolutionary new anatomical feature appeared: the jaw. The first jawed fish, the acanthodians or spiny sharks, evolved from the gill arches of their jawless ancestors. This was a game changer. Jaws allowed for a new way of life, enabling fish to grasp, bite, and chew their food. It turned them from passive filter feeders into active predators. This single innovation would set the stage for the vertebrates to rise from humble, armoured bottom dwellers to become the dominant group of animals in the oceans, and, eventually, on land, on the continents. The plants continued their slow advance, growing slightly larger and developing the first simple vascular tissues to transport water, a key adaptation for living further from the water's edge. The world was healing, and evolution was once again setting the stage for a new explosion of life. What would happen now that the seas were filled with fast, agile, jawed predators? The age of fishes was about to dawn. Our journey now leads us into the Devonian period, a chapter in Earth's history that began roughly 419 million years ago. This is a time of profound transformation, both in the water and on the land. The world's geography is still in flux. The continents of Laurentia and Baltica have collided, forming a new, larger landmass called Euramerica, or the Old Red Sandstone Continent, so named for the distinctive red sediments that were laid down in its arid interior. This new continent sits near the equator, while the massive supercontinent of Gondwana continues to dominate the southern hemisphere. The climate is generally warm and stable, and the oceans are about to witness the rise of a new dynasty of rulers. This is rightly called the Age of Fishes. The innovation of the jaw, which first appeared in the Silurian, has now led to an incredible evolutionary radiation. The seas are filled with an astonishing variety of fish, showcasing a wild burst of creativity that rivals the Cambrian explosion in its significance for vertebrate life. Imagine yourself submerged in a Devonian ocean. It is a world ruled by armour and teeth. The placoderms, a now extinct class of armoured fish, are the undisputed kings of the sea. They are covered in thick, bony plates, especially around their heads and thoraxes, like aquatic knights in shining armour. They come in all shapes and sizes, from small bottom dwellers to the terrifying apex predator of the age Dunkleosteus. This was a creature of nightmares, growing up to 10 metres in length, the size of a school bus. Dunkleosteus was not a fast swimmer, but it was an ambush predator of immense power. It had no teeth in the conventional sense. Instead, its powerful jaws were lined with sharp, bony plates that functioned like a self-sharpening guillotine. Biomechanical studies have shown that its bite was one of the most powerful in the history of life, capable of snapping with incredible speed and force, strong enough to shear through the thick armour of other placoderms. Fossils of Dunkleosteus are often found with partially digested remains of other armoured fish inside them, a testament to their brutal reign. The oceans were a dangerous place, a world of armoured giants clashing in a perpetual battle for survival. Alongside the placoderms, other groups of fish were thriving. The cartilaginous fish, the ancestors of today's sharks and rays, were becoming more common. These early sharks, like Cladocellach, were smaller and more streamlined than the bulky placoderms, representing a different evolutionary strategy, speed and agility over heavy armour. And then there were the bony fish, the group that would ultimately give rise to the vast majority of modern fish species, and to us. This group split into two major lineages. The first were the ray-finned fishes, whose fins are supported by thin, bony rays. They would go on to become the dominant group of fish in the world. The second group were the lobe-finned fishes. Their fins were different fleshy, lobe-like, and supported by a single, stout bone. This seemingly minor anatomical difference would have profound consequences for the history of life. These lobe-finned fish, cruising through the Devonian waters, carried within their fins the architectural blueprint for the arms and legs of all future land vertebrates. They were living, breathing precursors to a monumental evolutionary leap. While the oceans were teeming with these new vertebrate predators, the continents were undergoing a revolution of their own. The planet was turning green. For the first time in Earth's history, great forests were beginning to spread across the land. The tiny moss-like plants of the Silurian had given way to much more complex and larger forms. The evolution of vascular tissue, a kind of internal plumbing that allows for the transport of water and nutrients, enabled plants to grow tall and colonize drier, inland environments. Ferns and giant horsetails formed a dense understory, while the first true trees, like Archaeopteris, reached for the sky. Archaeopteris was a remarkable plant. It had a woody trunk, much like a modern conifer, but it reproduced with spores, like a fern. These first forests were alien in appearance, composed of plants with strange textures and shapes, but they had a transformative effect on the planet. Their deep roots broke up rock, creating soil for the first time. This process, known as weathering, released minerals and nutrients from the land, which then washed into the oceans, further fueling marine life. The forests also began to draw huge amounts of carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which would eventually lead to a period of global cooling. The spread of these new, complex terrestrial habitats created opportunities for animals. The arthropods, the first pioneers on land, diversified. Spiders, mites, and the first wingless insects now crawled through the forest floor, feeding on decaying plant matter and each other. The air, however, was still silent. There were no birds, no buzzing insects, nothing to break the sound of the wind rustling through the strange, fern-like leaves of the primeval forests. But this was about to change. Some of the lobe-finned fish that lived in shallow, freshwater environments, perhaps in swamps or river deltas that were prone to drying out, began to use their strong, bony fins for a new purpose. They could prop themselves up on the bottom, and perhaps even pull themselves out of the water for short periods, moving from one pool to another. They also possessed another crucial adaptation, lungs, which had evolved from the swim bladder, allowing them to breathe air. Here, the mystery of one of evolution's greatest transitions begins to unfold. Fossils like the famous Tiktaalik, discovered in the Canadian Arctic, provide a stunning snapshot of this process. Tiktaalik had the scales, fins, and gills of a fish, but it also had the flattened, crocodile-like skull of an amphibian. Its fleshy fins contained a bone structure that is unmistakably the precursor to a wrist, elbow, and shoulder. It could do a push-up. This was not a fish that was trying to become a land animal. It was a fish that had adapted perfectly to life in the shallows, a complex environment that was part water, part land. It was the perfect transitional form, a living bridge between two worlds. Imagine this creature, pushing its head out of the murky water, its eyes peering into a new, unclaimed world. A world of green forests, rich in oxygen, and full of invertebrate prey for the taking. This was the moment that our own deep ancestry hauled itself out of the water and took its first tentative breaths of air on solid ground. But just as life was making this incredible breakthrough, the world was once again heading for a crisis. The late Devonian period was marked by another of the Big Five mass extinctions. This was not a single catastrophic event like an asteroid impact, but a prolonged crisis that lasted for millions of years, with several pulses of extinction. The exact causes are still debated, but they are likely linked to the success of the very forests that had transformed the land. The huge increase in plant life on the continents led to an over-fertilization of the oceans. The nutrient-rich runoff from the newly formed soils caused massive algal blooms. When these algae died and sank to the bottom, their decomposition was carried out by bacteria that consumed vast amounts of oxygen, creating huge anoxic dead zones in the oceans. Marine life suffocated on a global scale. The magnificent placoderms, including the mighty Dunkleosteus, were wiped out completely. The beautiful and diverse coral reef ecosystems collapsed. In total, around 75% of all species on Earth vanished. The age of fishes came to a crashing, suffocating end. Life on land, however, was less affected. The four-limbed vertebrates, the tetrapods that had just begun their terrestrial journey, survived. They had stumbled into a new world, and now, with the seas in chaos, the land offered a refuge and a vast open frontier for the next great chapter of evolution. Emerging from the shadow of the late Devonian extinction, our planet entered a new geological period, the Carboniferous, which began around 358 million years ago. The world the survivors inherited was one of opportunity. The great armoured placoderms were gone from the seas, leaving a power vacuum that would be filled by the adaptable sharks and the ascendant ray-finned fishes. On land, the tetrapods, our four-limbed, air-breathing ancestors, had made it through the crisis. Now, with the terrestrial realm largely uncontested, they began to diversify, truly committing to a life lived on solid ground. The world's continents were continuing their slow-motion collision. Gondwana still dominated the south, but Euramerica and other landmasses were closing in, on course to form the next great supercontinent, Pangaea. For much of the Carboniferous, however, large parts of these continents, particularly those near the equator, were low-lying and covered by warm, shallow seas. This created the perfect conditions for a world unlike any seen before or since. This was the age of the great coal forests, a time when the earth would be buried in green. If you could stand in a Carboniferous forest, the air itself would feel different. It would be thick, humid, and heavy with moisture, and it would be incredibly rich in oxygen. The proliferation of vast forests during the Devonian had already started to change the atmosphere, but in the Carboniferous, this process went into overdrive. Oxygen levels soared, reaching as high as 35%, compared to the 21% we breathe today. This oxygen-rich atmosphere would have had profound effects. Wildfires would have been frequent and incredibly intense, and the very air would have had a different density, making flight easier. But most importantly, it allowed for the evolution of giants. The flora of these forests was alien and spectacular. There were no flowering plants, no fruit, no pine cones. Instead, the world was dominated by more primitive groups of plants that grew to monstrous sizes. The forest canopy was formed by giant club mosses, like Lepidodendron, the scale tree. Today, club mosses are tiny, humble plants, but in the Carboniferous, they grew into woody, tree-like giants, reaching heights of over 30 meters. Their trunks were covered in a distinctive, diamond-shaped pattern of leaf scars, and instead of a complex branching structure, they often forked into two main branches at their crown. Alongside them grew calamites, giant relatives of modern horsetails. While their living descendants are small, reed-like plants, Carboniferous calamites grew as tall as modern trees, their segmented, bamboo-like trunks forming dense thickets. The understory was a sea of ferns, some of which also grew to tree-like proportions. These plants did not reproduce with seeds, but with spores which required water for fertilization. The entire landscape was essentially a vast, continental-scale swamp. The ground was waterlogged, a labyrinth of murky pools, sluggish rivers, and mud. When these colossal trees died, they did not decompose in the way they do today. They fell into the stagnant, oxygen-poor water of the swamps, where the bacteria and fungi that normally break down wood could not thrive. Instead of rotting away, the woody debris simply piled up, layer upon layer, for millions of years. Over time, this accumulated plant matter was buried by sediment, compressed, and cooked by the Earth's internal heat, eventually transforming into the massive coal seams that powered our Industrial Revolution. The electricity that lights our homes tonight is, in many cases, the stored sunlight of a Carboniferous summer, captured by these strange, primeval forests 300 million years ago. This hot, humid, oxygen-rich world was a paradise for the creatures that inhabited it, especially the arthropods. The high oxygen concentration supercharged their relatively inefficient respiratory systems, allowing them to grow to sizes that seem impossible today. This was the age of giant bugs. Imagine walking through the damp undergrowth and hearing a loud clattering sound. You look up to see Meganeura, a giant dragonfly hovering in the air. It looks just like a modern dragonfly, but it has the wingspan of a hawk, over 75 centimetres across. They were formidable aerial predators, their huge compound eyes scanning the forest for prey. And what was their prey? Likely other large insects, and perhaps even some of the smaller amphibians and reptiles that were beginning to populate the forest floor. Speaking of the forest floor, you would have to watch your step for Arthropleura. This was a giant millipede, the largest terrestrial arthropod that has ever lived. It grew to be over 2 meters long, the size of a small car, its wide, flattened, segmented body protected by thick armoured plates. Despite its terrifying appearance, Arthropleura was likely a herbivore, peacefully munching its way through the decaying vegetation of the swampy ground. In the water, giant amphibians lurked, and the air buzzed with a variety of insects, many of them far larger than their modern counterparts. And what of our own ancestors, the tetrapods? They flourished in this swampy world. The early Carboniferous was dominated by the amphibians. Creatures like Eriops, a large, robust amphibian with a wide, flattened skull and a powerful tail, were common predators in the waterways, behaving much like modern crocodiles, lurking just below the surface to ambush fish and any smaller land animals that ventured too close to the water's edge. They were tied to the water, needing to lay their soft, jelly-like eggs in ponds and swamps to prevent them from drying out. But during the Carboniferous, a crucial evolutionary innovation occurred that would allow vertebrates to finally sever their ties to the aquatic world. This was the amniotic egg. This new type of egg had a protective, semi-permeable shell and a series of internal membranes that created a private little pond for the developing embryo. It could be laid on dry land without drying out. This was a revolutionary adaptation. The animals that evolved this ability are called amniotes, and they represent the common ancestor of all reptiles, birds, and mammals. The appearance of the amniotic egg marks a fundamental split in the vertebrate family tree. One branch, the sauropsids, would lead to the dinosaurs, birds, and all modern reptiles. The other branch, the synapsids, would eventually lead to us, the mammals. In the late Carboniferous, these first amniotes were small, lizard-like creatures, scurrying through the undergrowth, likely hunting the giant insects that filled the forests. They were a minor part of the ecosystem, living in the shadows of the giant amphibians and monstrous arthropods. But they held the key to the future. They were no longer bound to the water's edge. They could now explore and conquer the drier, inland regions of the continents. As the Carboniferous period drew to a close, the world was beginning to change again. The continents were finally crunching together to form the supercontinent of Pangaea. This massive geological event pushed up mountain ranges and drained the shallow seas, causing the climate to become cooler and drier. The great coal swamps began to shrink. For the amphibians that depended on them, this was a disaster. But for the small, unassuming amniotes with their revolutionary new egg, This drier world was a world of opportunity. A new age was dawning, and a new group of animals was poised to take over the land. Leaving the steamy, swamp-filled world of the Carboniferous behind, we enter the Permian period, which began 200 million years ago. This next chapter in Earth's story is a time of extremes, a world shaped by a new and dramatic continental arrangement. The slow, grinding collision of the planet's landmasses is now complete. For the first time since the breakup of Rodinia hundreds of millions of years earlier, nearly all of the Earth's continents are joined together into a single, colossal supercontinent. Scientists call it Pangaea. This immense landmass stretched from the South Pole to the North Pole, surrounded by a vast, world-spanning ocean known as Panthalassa. The formation of such a supercontinent had a profound and dramatic effect on the global climate. With so much land clustered together, the moderating influence of the oceans was lost to the interior. The heart of Pangaea became a vast and arid desert, subject to extreme temperature swings between scorching summers and frigid winters. The great coal swamps of the Carboniferous dried up and vanished, replaced by more rugged, hardy vegetation. This new, drier world presented a challenge to the old guard of life, but for the newly evolved amniotes, it was a world of immense opportunity. The amphibians, so dominant in the Carboniferous swamps, found their reign coming to an end. Their reliance on water for reproduction and their moist skin, which was prone to drying out, made them ill-suited for the arid interior of Pangaea. While some survived and adapted, they were relegated to the margins, to the riverbanks and wetlands that still remained. The future belonged to the creatures who had mastered life on dry land. The amniotes, with their waterproof skin and their self-contained eggs, were perfectly equipped to thrive in this new world. And one group of amniotes, in particular, rose to dominance with spectacular success. This was the age of the synapsids, the group that includes the ancestors of all mammals. For the next 50 million years, these mammal-like reptiles would be the undisputed rulers of the terrestrial world, the dominant predators and herbivores across the vast plains of Pangaea. They were the first truly successful land dynasty of the amniotes. If you could travel back to the early Permian plains of what is now North America, you would be greeted by a sight both alien and strangely familiar. The landscape is scrubby and dry, with hardy, cone-bearing plants called gymnosperms, the ancestors of modern pines and conifers, beginning to spread across the supercontinent. These were the first seed-bearing plants, another evolutionary innovation that freed the plant kingdom from its reliance on water for reproduction. In this rugged environment, you would see herds of large, barrel-chested herbivores munching on the tough vegetation. But your attention would inevitably be drawn to the apex predator of this time, a creature as fascinating as it was terrifying Dimetrodon. When you picture this animal, you might think of it as a dinosaur, but that would be incorrect. Dimetrodon is not a dinosaur. In fact, it is more closely related to you than it is to a Tyrannosaurus rex. It was a synapsid, a proud member of our own extended family tree, which lived and died out more than 40 million years before the first dinosaurs even appeared. Encountering a Dimetrodon would be an awe-inspiring experience. The largest species could grow up to 5 meters long and weigh over 225 kilograms. It walked with a sprawling crocodile-like gait. Its body held low to the ground. Its most striking feature of one siege, of course, was the magnificent sail on its back. This was not a fleshy fin, but a structure of skin stretched over incredibly long, thin spines that grew directly from its vertebrae. For decades, scientists have debated the purpose of this spectacular sail. The leading theory is that it was a sophisticated thermoregulatory device, a kind of biological solar panel. In the cool Permian mornings, Dimetrodon could turn its sail towards the sun, soaking up warmth and raising its body temperature much faster than its cold-blooded prey. This would give it a crucial advantage, allowing it to become active and start hunting while other animals were still sluggish and cold. Conversely, if it became too hot in the midday sun, it could angle the sail away from the sun and use it to dissipate excess heat into the breeze. It was a highly effective way to manage body temperature in a world of climatic extremes. But the sail was not its only impressive feature. A look inside its mouth would reveal another clue to its mammalian ancestry. Unlike the simple, peg-like teeth of most reptiles, Dimetrodon had a differentiated dentition. It had sharp, canine-like teeth for stabbing, smaller incisors for gripping, and blunter teeth at the back for shearing meat from bone. This specialization of teeth is a hallmark of mammals, and it shows that the synapsids were already on the evolutionary path that would lead to the complex jaws and teeth of their distant descendants. Dimetrodon was the undisputed top predator of its time, a formidable hunter that sat at the peak of the early Permian food web. It was a creature perfectly adapted to its world, a successful and powerful ruler of the Pangaean continent. As we moved through the millions of years of the Middle Permian, the climate continued to grow hotter and drier. Volcanic activity was on the rise, spewing greenhouse gases into the atmosphere and contributing to the warming trend. In this changing world, the synapsids continued to evolve and diversify. The primitive pelycosaurs, like Dimetrodon, were gradually replaced by a more advanced and successful group of synapsids called the therapsids. These creatures were even more mammal-like in their appearance and biology. Their legs were positioned more directly underneath their bodies, allowing for a more upright and efficient stance, a significant step away from the sprawling gait of their ancestors. This would have made them more agile and faster-moving animals. Their skulls showed an enlargement of the temporal fenestra, an opening behind the eye socket that anchored larger and more powerful jaw muscles, allowing for a stronger bite. The therapsids came in an incredible variety of forms. There were the dinocephalians, or terrible heads, which included large, bulky herbivores like moschops, and fearsome predators with interlocking, blade-like teeth. There were the dicynodonts, a highly successful group of tusked-beaked herbivores that browsed on the tough Permian vegetation. They ranged in size from small-panned burrowing animals to creatures as large as modern-day hippos. And then there were the cynodonts, the dog-toothed therapsids. This group was the most mammal-like of all. They were generally smaller, often nocturnal predators and insectivores. They likely had whiskers and, perhaps, even the first traces of fur. Their differentiated teeth were becoming even more specialized, and the structure of their jaws and inner ears was taking on a pattern that is unmistakably mammalian. These small, furry-looking creatures, scurrying through the Permian night, were our direct ancestors. They carried within them the genetic legacy that would survive a coming apocalypse, and one day give rise to the age of mammals. But they were living in a world that was becoming increasingly hostile. The relentless warming and volcanic activity were signs of a deep sickness within the planet's systems. A catastrophe was brewing, a disaster on a scale that life had never before experienced. The reign of the synapsids, and indeed almost all life on Earth, was about to come to a brutal and sudden end. As our journey continues into the late Permian period, around 260 million years ago, the world is dominated by the supercontinent of Pangaea. The planet is growing hotter, and the vast interior of this single landmass has become an immense desert, larger than any that exists today. Life has been pushed to the continental margins, the coastal regions where the moderating influence of the great Panthalassic Ocean can still be felt, and to the temperate and polar zones in the far north and south. In these refuges, life continues to thrive, but it is a world living on a knife's edge. The synapsids, our distant mammal-like relatives, still rule the land, but the cast of characters has changed. The therapsids, more advanced and active than their pelycosaur ancestors like Dimetrodon, have diversified into a stunning array of forms, filling ecological niches across the globe. Imagine yourself on the plains of what would one day become southern Africa. The air is warm and dry. The vegetation is tough and scrubby, dominated by seed ferns and hardy conifers. In this environment, you might encounter one of the most successful and common animals of the late Permian Lystrosaurus. This creature is a dicynodont, a member of that group of tusked, herbivorous therapsids. It looks like a bizarre cross between a lizard and a pig, about the size of a modern hog. It has a barrel-shaped body, powerful front legs that were well suited for digging and burrowing, and a beaked, turtle-like mouth. Its only teeth are a pair of prominent tusks, which it likely used for defence and for rooting up tubers and tough plant stems. Lystrosaurus is not a glamorous or terrifying beast, but it is a survivor. Its stocky build and burrowing habits would prove to be crucial adaptations for the hard times that were to come. It is one of the key players in our story, a humble herbivore that would soon find itself in a world almost devoid of life, while Lystrosaurus munches on roots, other more formidable therapsids roam the landscape. This is the time of the Gorgonopsians, the apex predators of the late Permian. Their name means Gorgon face, a reference to the fearsome monsters of Greek myth, and it is a fitting title. These were wolf to bear-sized carnivores, built for speed and power. They had long, powerful legs, a sleek and muscular body, and a skull armed with enormous, saber-like canine teeth. Gorgonopsians were the saber-toothed cats of their day, highly efficient killers that likely hunted the large, herbivorous dicynodonts that populated the Pangaean plains. They represent the peak of synapsid evolution before the Great Catastrophe, a perfect and deadly expression of the predatory form. To witness a Gorgonopsid on the hunt would be to see a world of fierce and primal competition, a dynamic ecosystem in its final, glorious moments before collapse, and scurrying in the undergrowth, often unseen, are the cynodonts. These are the therapsids that are most closely related to us. Creatures like Thrinaxodon were small, about the size of a cat, and likely nocturnal. Their anatomy shows a suite of features that are undeniably mammalian. They had a secondary palate, a bony shelf in the roof of the mouth that separated the nasal passage from the mouth. This crucial adaptation allowed them to breathe and eat at the same time, something essential for an active animal with a high metabolism. It is a feature that you are using right now as you breathe. Their jaws were becoming more sophisticated, and they likely had sensitive whiskers on their snouts, helping them to navigate and find insect prey in the dark. It is highly probable that they were covered in fur, an adaptation for staying warm during the cool nights. These small, unassuming creatures were living a very different life from the great Gorgonopsids and the herds of Lystrosaurus. They were living on the margins, in the shadows, a strategy that would inadvertently prepare them for surviving a world plunged into darkness. Meanwhile, in the great Panthalassic Ocean, life was also rich and diverse. The seas had recovered from the Devonian extinction and were now home to complex reef ecosystems built by sponges and algae. The fish were abundant, with sharks and bony fish diversifying. There were also marine reptiles, early pioneers who had returned to the sea, foreshadowing the later age of the great sea monsters. The world, both on land and in the water, seemed stable. A mature and complex biosphere that had been evolving for hundreds of millions of years. But deep within the Earth, a geological time bomb was ticking. In a remote region of Pangaea, in what is now modern-day Siberia, something was stirring far beneath the crust. A massive plume of superheated magma, rising from deep within the Earth's mantle, was about to breach the surface. This was not a typical volcano. This was the beginning of a flood basalt eruption, a volcanic event on a scale that is almost impossible to imagine. When it began, it would not be a single explosion, but a series of immense fissures that would rip open across the landscape, some of them hundreds of kilometers long. From these fissures, colossal curtains of fire would erupt, spewing lava and toxic gases high into the atmosphere, rivers of molten rock, thousands of times larger than any volcanic eruption in human history, would pour across the land, burying an area the size of Western Europe under a thick blanket of basalt. And this was not a one-time event. This eruption would continue, on and off, for nearly 1,000,000 years. The immediate effects would have been devastating for any life in the vicinity, but the true catastrophe was global. The sheer volume of greenhouse gases released into the atmosphere was staggering. Carbon dioxide and methane poured into the sky at a catastrophic rate, triggering a runaway greenhouse effect. Global temperatures began to soar, rising by as much as 10 degrees Celsius on land and creating lethally hot conditions in the tropics. The volcanic gases, particularly sulfur dioxide, mixed with atmospheric waters to create acid rain, which fell across the globe, poisoning soils and acidifying the oceans. As the planet heated up, the chemistry of the oceans began to change dramatically. The warm water could hold less dissolved oxygen, and the circulation patterns that brought oxygenated water down to the deep sea began to shut down. The oceans began to stratify, with the deep waters becoming an anoxic, stagnant, and poisonous soup, rich in hydrogen sulfide produced by anaerobic bacteria. This toxic water may have even burped hydrogen sulfide gas into the atmosphere, further poisoning the air. For the creatures living through this, the world was turning into a hellscape. They were being attacked from all sides. On land, they faced soaring temperatures, toxic air, and acid rain that destroyed the plants at the base of the food chain. In the seas, they faced a triple threat of rising temperatures, plummeting oxygen levels, and increasing acidity that made it impossible for shell-building organisms to survive. The intricate web of life, built up over 500 million years, was beginning to unravel at a terrifying speed. The gorgonopsids, the apex predators, found their prey disappearing. The great herds of dicynodonts starved as the vegetation died off. The delicate reef ecosystems collapsed. The planet was experiencing a systemic, cascading failure of its life support systems. The stage was set for the single greatest catastrophe in the history of complex life. The Great Dying had begun. We now arrive at the darkest chapter in the history of life on Earth. A moment of such profound devastation that it makes the extinction of the dinosaurs look like a minor disturbance. This is the Permian-Triassic extinction event, more commonly and aptly known as the Great Dying. It occurred approximately 252 million years ago, and it represents the most severe biodiversity crisis the planet has ever endured. The intricate, vibrant world of the late Permian, with its saber-toothed synapsids and its diverse ocean reefs. was about to be systematically and brutally erased. The cause, as we have seen, was the immense and prolonged volcanic activity in the Siberian traps, but the eruption itself was just the trigger. The true horror of the Great Dying lay in the cascading environmental collapse that it unleashed upon the world. A domino effect of destruction that pushed the biosphere to the very brink of total annihilation. Imagine the scene as the catastrophe unfolds. The Siberian traps are not a single cone-shaped volcano, but a vast volcanic province. The ground splits open, and for hundreds of kilometres, curtains of lava fountain into the sky. The air is thick with ash and the choking smell of sulphur. This continues for hundreds of thousands of years, a relentless geological assault on the atmosphere. The first and most direct consequence is the release of colossal amounts of carbon dioxide. This potent greenhouse gas begins to warm the planet at an alarming rate. As global temperatures climb, another, even more powerful greenhouse gas is released from the seabed, methane, trapped in frozen crystals called methane hydrates on the cold continental shelves. This methane is released as the oceans warm, bubbling up to the surface and into the atmosphere, causing the warming to accelerate even further. This is a runaway feedback loop, a vicious cycle of heating that pushes the climate far beyond its tipping point. Global average temperatures may have soared over 28 degrees Celsius, with equatorial land temperatures reaching an unbearable 40 degrees or more. The world was turning into an oven. For life on land, this extreme heat was a direct and deadly threat. Many animals simply could not cope with the relentless, scorching temperatures. But the heat also brought drought, turning vast swathes of Pangaea into uninhabitable desert. The hardy Permian flora, adapted to a dry climate, began to die off, unable to withstand the new extremes. This led to a collapse of the food web from the bottom up. The large herbivores, like the diverse dicynodonts, began to starve, with their food source gone. The apex predators, the mighty Gorgonopsians, soon followed. The fossil record from this time paints a grim picture. In the layers of rock just before the extinction boundary, we see a rich and diverse ecosystem. In the layers immediately after, there is an eerie emptiness, a fossil desert that signifies a world scrubbed clean of its former inhabitants. But the true apocalypse was happening in the oceans. The warming atmosphere transferred its heat to the sea surface, raising ocean temperatures to lethal levels, especially in the tropics. More insidiously, as the water warmed, it lost its ability to hold dissolved oxygen. At the same time, the normal ocean circulation patterns, which act like a planetary lung, carrying oxygen-rich surface water down to the deep, began to break down. The oceans became stagnant. In the deep, dark waters, with no oxygen supply, anaerobic bacteria thrived. These bacteria use sulfate instead of oxygen for respiration, and their waste product is hydrogen sulfide, a highly toxic gas. The deep ocean turned into a poisonous, anoxic broth. This toxic, oxygen-free water then began to rise, encroaching on the shallow shelves where most marine life lived. Imagine being a fish or a trilobite in a Permian reef. Your world is getting warmer, and with each passing day, it's becoming harder to breathe. Then, a creeping, invisible poison begins to rise from the depths, suffocating everything in its path. The volcanic gases also had another devastating effect on the oceans. The sulfur dioxide and carbon dioxide released by the Siberian traps dissolved in seawater to form sulfuric and carbonic acid. The oceans began to acidify. This change in water chemistry was a death sentence for any organism that built a shell or skeleton out of calcium carbonate. The corals, the brachiopods, the clams, their shells literally began to dissolve. The very foundations of the marine ecosystem, the reefs that had been thriving for millions of years, crumbled and died. The once clear, vibrant tropical seas became a toxic, acidic, and breathless wasteland. The scale of the extinction is difficult to comprehend. In the oceans, an estimated 90% of all species vanished forever. The trilobites, which had survived for 270 million years since their spectacular debut in the Cambrian explosion, were finally wiped out. The great sea scorpion predators were gone. The intricate reef ecosystems were gone. The seas fell silent. On land, the devastation was just as severe. Around 70% of all terrestrial vertebrate species became extinct. The entire ecosystem was reset. The ruling dynasty of the therapsids was shattered. The fearsome gorgonopsians vanished completely. The vast majority of the dicynodont herbivores disappeared. Even the insects, which are typically resilient survivors of extinction events, suffered their only mass extinction in their entire history. When the dust settled, the world was a desolate, impoverished ghost of its former self. The planet that emerged from the Great Dying was a broken world. The intricate complexity of life had been replaced by a grim and monotonous simplicity. The land was dominated by fungi for a time, which thrived on the immense amounts of dead and decaying matter. When plants finally began to recover, they were weedy, opportunistic species that formed low-diversity ecosystems. The lush forests were gone, replaced by sparse scrubland. Who were the survivors on land? The most successful was the humble burrowing herbivore, Lystrosaurus. For a brief period in the early Triassic, after the extinction, fossils of Lystrosaurus account for as many as 95% of all terrestrial vertebrate fossils found. Its ability to dig burrows may have allowed it to escape the worst of the heat, and its simple, non-specialized diet of roots and tubers may have helped it survive when other plants died off. It was a world dominated by a single, disaster-adapted species, and among the other survivors were the small, nocturnal cynodonts, our ancestors. They had weathered the storm, perhaps due to their small size, their ability to burrow, and their potentially warm-blooded metabolism that allowed them to remain active in the cooler parts of the day or night. They had survived, but their future was far from certain. The world they had inherited was empty, a blank slate. The extinction had not only wiped out the old rulers of the Permian, but it had also cleared the way for a new group of animals to rise from obscurity and begin a dynasty that would last for another 180 million years. The age of the synapsids was over. The age of the archosaurs, and their most famous descendants, the dinosaurs, was about to begin. The Great Dying was not just an end. It was a violent and brutal beginning. The Great Fire of the Permian Triassic extinction has passed, but the world it left behind is a smouldering ruin. We have now entered the early Triassic period, a strange and difficult chapter in Earth's history that began in the immediate aftermath of the apocalypse. This is not a time of glorious renewal, but a prolonged and painful recovery. The planet is a hostile, broken version of its former self, a disaster ecosystem struggling to regain its footing after the most profound trauma life has ever experienced. The Siberian Traps volcanoes may have quieted, but the damage to the climate and the biosphere would take millions of years to heal. The world of the early Triassic is a hot, dry, and monotonous landscape under a hazy, carbon dioxide-rich sky. The lush, diverse forests of the Permian are gone, replaced by sparse, scrubby vegetation dominated by a few hardy, opportunistic plant species. The intricate food webs have been obliterated, and the world's ecosystems are characterized by a grim simplicity. Imagine standing on the dusty plains of Pangaea in the early Triassic. The heat is oppressive. The rivers are sluggish and choked with sediment, as the lack of deep-rooted plants on the continents has led to massive soil erosion. The vibrant animal chorus of the Permian is gone, replaced by an eerie silence. This is the world of the survivors, the few resilient lineages that managed to cling to life through the great dying. And one survivor, in particular, is everywhere. As we saw, the most common terrestrial vertebrate on Earth at this time is Lestrosaurus, the pig-sized, tusked dicynodont. Having survived the extinction, it exploded in population in the vacant world that followed. Its fossils are found all over the globe, from South Africa to India to Antarctica, which at the time were all connected as part of Pangaea. This widespread distribution of a single land-dwelling animal provided some of the key early evidence for the theory of continental drift. For a few million years, Earth was the planet of Lystrosaurus. Its success was likely due to its burrowing habits, which could have offered protection from the harsh climate, and its generalized diet. It was a disaster taxon, a species that thrived in the chaotic aftermath of destruction, a testament to the power of resilience over might. But Lystrosaurus was not alone. Scurrying in the shadows, our own ancestors, the cynodonts, had also made it through. These small, furry, mammal-like creatures continued their evolution in this harsh new world. Without the large Gorgonopsian predators to hunt them, they faced new opportunities. They began to diversify, evolving more advanced mammalian characteristics. They were still small, living a marginal existence, but they were adapting and biding their time. They were the seed of the future age of mammals, quietly waiting for their moment, which was still more than 150 million years in the future. The survivors of the Great Dying had one thing in common: they were hardy generalists. The specialists, the animals that were perfectly adapted to the stable Permian world, had been the first to go. Now, the planet belonged to the tough, the adaptable, and the lucky. In this slowly recovering world, a new group of reptiles began to rise to prominence. They were the archosaurs, the ruling lizards. This group had its roots in the Permian, but the extinction event had cleared the slate, removing their synapsid competitors and opening up a world of ecological possibilities. The archosaurs were built for this new, hostile world. They had adaptations for conserving water, and their more efficient, semi-upright posture gave them an advantage in covering the vast, arid distances of Pangaea. In the early Triassic, these archosaurs were not yet the giants they would become, but they were beginning to diversify. One of the most common was Euparkeria, a small, nimble predator about 1/2 metre long. It was lightly built and could lightly run on its 2 hind legs for short bursts of speed, a trait that would become a hallmark of many of its descendants. It was an agile hunter of insects and smaller vertebrates. The archosaur lineage soon split into 2 main branches, setting up a rivalry that would last for millions of years. One branch was the Cruratasi, or the crocodile line archosaurs. In the Triassic, this was an incredibly diverse and successful group. They evolved into a wide variety of forms, including large, quadrupedal apex predators that looked superficially like the Gorgonopsians they had replaced. Creatures like Erythrosicus were fearsome hunters, with massive skulls and powerful jaws, establishing themselves as the new top predators of the recovering ecosystems. The other branch was the Avamatae tarsalia, the bird-line archosaurs. This group would ultimately give rise to the pterosaurs and the dinosaurs. In the early Triassic, they were still small and rare, living in the shadow of their crocodile-line cousins. No one at the time could have guessed that this minor group of archosaurs held the key to the next great geological era. The recovery from the Permian-Triassic extinction was painfully slow. For about 5 to 10 million years, the planet's ecosystems remained in a state of prolonged stagnation. The usual pattern after a mass extinction is a rapid evolutionary radiation of the survivors, but the early Triassic was different. The climate remained unstable, with wild temperature swings, and the oceans were still suffering from low oxygen levels. Life seemed to be stuck in a low diversity, low productivity state. This period is sometimes called the coal gap, as no coal deposits are found anywhere on Earth from this time, a sign that the vast peat-forming forests had not yet recovered. It was as if the engine of evolution had stalled. But eventually, slowly, the Earth began to heal. The excess carbon dioxide in the atmosphere was gradually drawn down, absorbed by the oceans and buried in sediments. Global temperatures began to stabilize. The ocean circulation patterns re-established themselves, bringing oxygen back to the depths. On land, the plant communities began to recover their diversity. The hardy flora of the immediate aftermath was replaced by new forests of conifers, cycads, and ginkgos. With the recovery of the plants, new opportunities arose for the animals. As we move into the Middle and Late Triassic, the world is finally returning to a state of complex, diverse ecosystems. The crocodile-line archosaurs are the dominant land predators, but the bird-line archosaurs are catching up. And it is in the late Triassic, around 230 million years ago, that a new group of animals makes its first appearance in the fossil record. They are small, bipedal, and lightly built. They are a subgroup of the bird-line archosaurs. They are the first true dinosaurs. Creatures like Eoraptor and Herrerasaurus were nimble, fast-moving carnivores. But they were not yet the rulers of their world. They were just one of several competing groups of reptiles in a world still dominated by their crurotarsan cousins. They were a promising but minor part of the fauna. Another mass extinction, one that would selectively prune the tree of life once again, would be needed to clear the stage for them to truly rise to power and begin their long and spectacular reign. As the Triassic period unfolds, the world is finally shaking off the long, dark shadow of the Great Dying. Life is diversifying with renewed vigour, and the continents of Pangaea are covered in vast forest of conifers, cycads, and ferns. The planet is on the threshold of a new era, the Mesozoic, an age that will be defined by the creatures that now emerge from the evolutionary crucible of the Triassic recovery. This is the dawn of the age of reptiles, and more famously, the age of dinosaurs. But their ascent to global dominance was not immediate, nor was it guaranteed. For much of the late Triassic, the dinosaurs were just one of several successful groups of archosaurs competing for resources on the vast, arid plains of the supercontinent. The world was still ruled by their crocodile-line cousins, the crurotarsans, and a variety of other reptiles. Imagine the landscape of the late Triassic, perhaps in a place like the petrified forest of modern-day Arizona. It is a world of seasonal monsoons, with a long dry season followed by torrential rains. The dominant herbivores are not dinosaurs, but large, tusked decinodonts, relatives of Lystrosaurus that have grown to immense sizes. The apex predators are creatures like Postosuchus, a huge, fearsome quadrupedal reptile from the crocodile line of archosaurs. It is the T-Rex of its day, a powerful ambush hunter that preys on the large herbivores. In this world, the first dinosaurs, like Chelophysis, are relatively small, slender, bipedal predators. They are fast and agile, likely hunting in packs to bring down prey larger than themselves. They are successful, but they are not yet in charge. They are the underdogs in a world of established giants. But the Earth's geological destiny had another dramatic turn in store. The supercontinent of Pangaea, which had shaped the world's climate and evolution for nearly 100 million years, was beginning to show signs of stress. The immense heat building up in the mantle beneath this insulating continental blanket was causing the crust to stretch, thin, and fracture. A great rift valley began to form down the centre of the supercontinent, an immense scar that would one day become the Atlantic Ocean. This rifting was accompanied by another massive flood, basalt eruption, the Central Atlantic Magmatic Province. While not as catastrophic as the Siberian traps, this volcanic event was still enormous, spewing huge amounts of greenhouse gases and sulfur into the atmosphere. This triggered another global warming event and acidified the oceans, leading to the Triassic-Jurassic mass extinction, another of the Big Five. This extinction event, occurring around 201 million years ago, was highly selective. It had a devastating impact on marine life, wiping out many species. On land, it was the crocodile-line archosaurs and the last of the large decinodonts that were hit the hardest. For reasons that are still not fully understood, the dinosaurs, on the other hand, sailed through the extinction relatively unscathed. Perhaps their more efficient, bird-like respiratory systems made them better able to cope with the low oxygen conditions of the time. Or perhaps it was simply a case of luck. Whatever the reason, the extinction event acted as a great filter, removing the dinosaurs' main competitors. The stage was now cleared. As life began to recover in the subsequent Jurassic period, the dinosaurs stepped into the ecological vacuum. Their long reign was about to begin. The breakup of Pangaea was a pivotal moment in the history of life. Let us pause our timeline for a moment to consider a fascinating question. What if it had never happened? What if Pangaea had remained a single, stable supercontinent to this day? Our world would be an utterly different place. The interior of this vast landmass would be an extreme desert, far larger and more arid than anything on Earth today, making it virtually uninhabitable for most complex life. The climate would be one of harsh extremes, with scorching summers and brutal winters, as the moderating influence of the oceans would be lost. The lack of continental separation would have had a profound effect on evolution. Without the isolation that drives the evolution of unique species on different continents, biodiversity would likely be much lower. The animals at the top of the food chain might have remained relatively uniform across the globe. Perhaps humans, if they ever evolved in such a world, would be a single, unified species, able to simply walk from what is now California to what is now England. The very course of our history, shaped by oceans and the exploration of new lands, would be unrecognizable. The breakup of Pangaea was not just a geological event. It was the catalyst that created the wonderfully diverse and varied world we know today. Returning to our timeline, the Jurassic period dawns on a world of fragmented continents and rising sea levels. The rifting of Pangaea has created new coastlines and shallow inland seas, bringing moisture back into the arid interiors. The climate becomes warmer and more humid, and the planet is covered in lush, jungle-like vegetation. This is the world that allowed the dinosaurs to achieve their full, spectacular potential. This is the age of giants. In the warm, humid Jurassic forests, the sauropods, the long-necked, long-tailed dinosaurs, evolved to sizes that beggar the imagination. These were the largest land animals ever to walk the earth. Herds of creatures like Brachiosaurus, with its giraffe-like neck held high to browse on the tallest trees, and Diplodocus, with its immensely long whip-like tail, moved through the landscape, their footsteps shaking the ground. Their sheer size was their primary defence against predators. An adult sauropod was a walking mountain of flesh, a formidable challenge for even the most ambitious carnivore. And the carnivores were indeed ambitious. The Jurassic was home to some of the most famous and fearsome predators of all time. In North America, the king of the Jurassic was Allosaurus, a large theropod dinosaur with a massive skull filled with serrated, blade-like teeth. It was a powerful hunter, likely preying on other large dinosaurs like Stegosaurus, with its distinctive double row of bony plates on its back and its lethally spiked tail. The oceans of the Jurassic were also ruled by reptiles, but not dinosaurs. Giant marine reptiles like the long-necked plesiosaurs and the dolphin-like ichthyosaurs were the top predators of the seas. In the air, the pterosaurs, the flying reptiles that were close cousins of the dinosaurs, diversified into a wide array of forms, from small bird-sized creatures to giants with impressive wingspans. The world was now fully in the grip of the reptiles, a global dynasty that ruled the land, the sea, and the air. The small, furry cynodonts, our ancestors, had by this time evolved into the first true mammals. But this was not their time. They were tiny, shrew-like creatures, living nocturnal lives in the shadows of the giants, scurrying through the undergrowth, trying to avoid being stepped on or eaten. Their story would have to wait. The Mesozoic was the age of the dinosaurs, a spectacular 180 million year reign that would see them evolve into an incredible diversity of forms and sizes, culminating in the appearance of the most famous and iconic predator the world has ever known. The world has entered the heart of the Mesozoic era, the Jurassic period, beginning approximately 201 million years ago. The great extinction that closed the Triassic has swept the board clean, removing the dinosaurs' primary competitors. The supercontinent of Pangaea is tearing itself apart, a slow-motion process of geological separation that will fundamentally reshape the planet. As North America drifts away from Africa, the nascent Atlantic Ocean is born. This continental rifting creates new coastlines and allows moisture-laden winds to penetrate deep into the continental interiors, transforming the arid landscapes of the Triassic into a much warmer, wetter, and more humid world. The planet is a greenhouse, with no polar ice caps and high sea levels that create vast, shallow inland seas. This lush, tropical environment, covered in vast forests of ferns, cycads, and conifers, provides the perfect conditions for life to flourish on an epic scale. This is the world that will give rise to the true giants, the largest animals ever to walk the earth. If you could be transported to the Morrison Formation of Western North America during the late Jurassic, you would find yourself in a dinosaur paradise. The landscape is a wide, flat floodplain, crossed by meandering rivers and dotted with lakes and wetlands. The vegetation is abundant, a seemingly endless buffet for the colossal herbivores that dominate this world. And it is their scale that is most difficult to comprehend. The sauropods, the iconic long-necked dinosaurs, have evolved to sizes that test the very limits of biology. Herds of Diplodocus, stretching up to 27 meters long, their tails like immense bullwhips, graze on the low-lying ferns. Towering over them all is Brachiosaurus, a true titan reaching 13 meters high, its neck held almost vertically like a crane, allowing it to browse on the leaves of the tallest conifers, a food source no other animal could reach. Their survival depended on processing immense quantities of plant matter every single day. They were living, breathing engines of consumption. Their gigantic guts filled with fermenting vegetation, their sheer mass, weighing many tens of tons, was their greatest defence. A healthy adult sauropod was simply too large, too powerful for any predator to take down. But what did it take, biologically, to be so enormous? The sauropods were marvels of engineering. Their vertebrae were not solid bone. They were filled with air sacs, part of a sophisticated bird-like respiratory system. This made their skeletons incredibly strong, yet remarkably lightweight, a crucial adaptation for supporting such a long neck. This respiratory system, with its one-way flow of air, was also far more efficient than our own mammalian lungs, allowing them to extract more oxygen from each breath to fuel their massive bodies. Their hearts would have been immense, powerful pumps, tasked with the monumental job of getting blood all the way up that long neck to the brain. Their metabolism is still a subject of debate among scientists. Were they slow, cold-blooded creatures? Or did they have a higher, more warm-blooded metabolism to sustain their active lifestyles? The evidence seems to point towards something in between, a unique physiology that has no modern equivalent. They grew at an incredible rate, going from a small hatchling to a multi-ton giant in just a couple of decades. A strategy to outgrow the threat of predation as quickly as possible, and predation was a constant threat. The Jurassic was not a peaceful paradise. It was a world of epic predator-prey battles. The top carnivore of this ecosystem was Allosaurus, a large theropod, up to 12 meters long. It was a formidable hunter. Its skull was large but surprisingly light, designed to withstand stress. Its teeth were long, sharp and serrated, perfect for slicing flesh. It likely hunted in packs to tackle the immense sauropods, perhaps targeting the young, the old, or the sick, harassing the herd and looking for a moment of weakness. Other predators shared this world. Ceratosaurus, recognizable by the prominent horn on its snout, was a mid-sized carnivore, while the landscape was also stalked by smaller, agile hunters. The herbivores, in turn, evolved a variety of defences. Stegosaurus, one of the most famous Jurassic dinosaurs, was a large, slow-moving plant-eater. Its back was adorned with a double row of large, bony plates. These plates were once thought to be for defence, but they were filled with blood vessels and were likely used for display or for thermoregulation, much like the sail of Dimetrodon. Its true weapon was at the end of its tail 4 long, sharp spikes, a formidable defensive armament that paleontologists have nicknamed the Thagomizer. Fossil evidence, including an Allosaurus vertebra with a puncture wound that perfectly matches a Stegosaurus tail spike, shows that these weapons were used with deadly effect. The Jurassic world was not just a world of giants on land. The oceans, now wider and more connected, were home to a new dynasty of marine rulers. These were not dinosaurs, but other groups of reptiles that had returned to the sea and become perfectly adapted to an aquatic life. The ichthyosaurs, which had first appeared in the Triassic, were now at their peak. They looked remarkably like modern dolphins, a classic example of convergent evolution, with streamlined bodies, powerful tails, and long snouts filled with teeth for catching fish and squid. They gave birth to live young at sea, fully severing their ties to the land. Swimming alongside them were the plesiosaurs. These came in 2 main varieties, the long-necked forms, like Elasmosaurus, which used their incredible necks to dart their small heads into schools of fish, and the short-necked pliosaurs. which were the apex predators of the Jurassic seas. A creature like Liopleurodon was a true sea monster, a colossal hunter with a huge skull and teeth like railroad spikes, preying on ichthyosaurs, plesiosaurs, and anything else that dared to swim in its territory. In the skies above, the pterosaurs continued their reign. These flying reptiles, the first vertebrates ever to achieve powered flight, were not dinosaurs, but their close cousins. In the Jurassic, they diversified into many forms. There were the early long-tailed rhamphorhynchoids, and the more advanced short-tailed pterodactyloids, which would go on to produce the giants of the Cretaceous. They soared over the coastlines, snatching fish from the surface of the water, occupying the ecological niche that would one day be taken by seabirds. Speaking of birds, the Jurassic is also when the first true birds appear in the fossil record. The famous Archaeopteryx, found in the fine-grained limestones of Germany, is a perfect transitional fossil. It has the feathers and wings of a bird, but it also has the teeth, claws, and long bony tail of a small theropod dinosaur. It is compelling evidence that birds are, in fact, dinosaurs, the direct descendants of a specific lineage of small feathered carnivores. They were a minor part of the Jurassic fauna, but their evolution marked the beginning of a new and incredibly successful vertebrate lineage. The world of the Jurassic was a world in motion, a dynamic interplay of geology and biology. The continents were drifting, the dinosaurs were growing to incredible sizes, and life was conquering every corner of the planet. But this long, stable, greenhouse age was not to last forever. The final chapter of the dinosaurs' reign, the Cretaceous, would see even more spectacular evolution, but it would also bring them face to face with a threat from beyond the stars. Our journey now takes us into the third and final act of the Mesozoic era, the Cretaceous period, beginning 145 million years ago. This was the longest period of the Mesozoic, a chapter that would see the dinosaurs reach their zenith of diversity and specialization before their sudden and catastrophic demise. The world continues to change. The continents are still drifting apart, further fragmenting the old supercontinent of Pangaea. The South Atlantic Ocean opens up, separating Africa from South America. India breaks away from Antarctica and begins its long northward journey towards Asia. This ongoing continental separation leads to increasing provincialism. The dinosaurs and other life forms on each isolated landmass begin to evolve in their own unique directions, creating a far more varied and diverse global fauna than existed in the Jurassic. The climate remains warm, a greenhouse world with high sea levels. In fact, during the mid-Cretaceous, the planet was warmer than at almost any other time in its history, with sea levels so high that a great inland waterway, the Western Interior Seaway, split North America in two. A significant evolutionary innovation in the plant kingdom occurs during the Cretaceous, the appearance of flowering plants, or angiosperms. For over 100 million years, the world's flora had been dominated by gymnosperms like conifers and cycads. The rise of flowering plants was a revolution. They reproduced more quickly and efficiently, often enlisting the help of insects for pollination. A new co-evolutionary partnership that would drive the diversification of both groups. By the end of the Cretaceous, flowering plants, including familiar trees like magnolias and sycamores, had come to dominate many of the world's ecosystems. This change in vegetation had a profound impact on the dinosaurs. The low-browsing herbivores, in particular, now had a new, abundant, and fast-growing food source. In this new world, the cast of dinosaurs changed dramatically. The giant sauropods of the Jurassic while still present in the southern continents, became much rarer in the north. They were replaced by new groups of highly successful herbivores. The most iconic of these were the horned dinosaurs, the ceratopsians. Triceratops, with its 3 facial horns and its massive, bony frill, is the most famous example. These were herd-living animals, the bison of the Cretaceous. Their horns and frills were likely used for defense against predators, but also for display and for contests between males, much like the antlers of modern deer. Grazing alongside them were the hadrosaurs, or duck-billed dinosaurs. These were incredibly successful and widespread herbivores, known for their elaborate head crests, which were hollow and connected to their nasal passages. It's believed these crests were used as resonating chambers to produce loud, distinctive calls for communication within their vast herds. They also had incredibly complex batteries of teeth, hundreds of them, perfect for grinding up the tough, new flowering plants. And where there are herds of giant herbivores, there are giant predators. The Cretaceous was the age of the tyrant lizards, the Carcharodontosaurids. Giant theropods with shark-like teeth were the apex predators for much of the period, particularly in the southern continents. But it is in the last few million years of the late Cretaceous in western North America that the most famous predator of all time appears Tyrannosaurus rex. This was the pinnacle of theropod evolution, a 2-legged killing machine of immense power. An adult T-Rex stood over 12 meters long and weighed up to 9 tons. Its most formidable weapon was its head. Its skull was massive, over 1.5 meters long, and built for strength. Its jaw muscles could deliver the most powerful bite force of any terrestrial animal that has ever lived. A bone-shattering bite capable of crushing the armour of its prey. Its teeth were like thick, serrated railroad spikes, designed not for slicing, but for puncturing and crushing. While its tiny 2-fingered arms have been the subject of much debate and even ridicule, they were a minor feature on an animal that was, for all intents and purposes, a walking set of jaws. T-Rex was the undisputed king of its world, a predator so powerful it could hunt the most well-defended herbivores of its time, like Triceratops and the heavily armoured Ankylosaurus. The skies of the Cretaceous also saw the rise of new giants. The pterosaurs, the flying reptiles, produced their largest forms, Quetzalcoatlus, with a wingspan of over 11 meters, the size of a small airplane, was the largest flying animal of all time. It was a terrifying sight, soaring over the Cretaceous plains. But the pterosaurs now had competition. The birds, which had first appeared in the Jurassic, were diversifying rapidly, evolving into a wide array of forms, from shorebird-like species to flightless, swimming birds like Hesperornis. They were smaller and more agile than the pterosaurs, and were likely beginning to outcompete them in many ecological niches. The oceans of the Cretaceous were perhaps the most dangerous they had ever been. The long-necked plesiosaurs and the dolphin-like ichthyosaurs were still present, but a new and terrifying group of marine reptiles had risen to become the absolute apex predators, the mosasaurs. These were not dinosaurs, but giant marine lizards, closely related to modern monitor lizards. They were perfectly adapted for a life of predation in the sea, with powerful flipper-like limbs and a long, muscular tail. They could grow to enormous sizes, some species reaching over 17 meters in length. Mosasaurs were ferocious hunters with a double-hinged jaw, like a snake, which allowed them to swallow their prey whole. They ate anything they could catch: fish, sharks, ammonites, and even other marine reptiles. They were the undisputed rulers of the late Cretaceous seas, the final and most fearsome dynasty of the Mesozoic marine reptiles. For millions of years, this vibrant, dynamic world of the late Cretaceous thrived. The dinosaurs had ruled the Earth for an almost unimaginable length of time, an empire lasting over 180 million years. They had survived continental breakup, changing climates, and the rise of new ecosystems. They were a hugely successful and adaptable group of animals, at the peak of their evolutionary prowess. It seemed as though their reign would last forever. But the universe had other plans. In the vast, cold emptiness of space between Mars and Jupiter, a single 10-kilometre wide piece of rock was on a trajectory that would intersect with the orbit of our planet. The dinosaurs, the mosasaurs, the pterosaurs, and countless other species were living out their final days, completely unaware that a cataclysm of cosmic proportions was about to bring their world to a sudden and violent end. The sky was about to fall. The late Cretaceous world is a thriving, mature biosphere. Herds of triceratops move through forests of flowering trees, watched from the shadows by the colossal Tyrannosaurus rex. In the oceans, mosasaurs hunt with terrifying efficiency. The air is shared by giant pterosaurs and a growing diversity of birds. The dynasty of the dinosaurs, a reign that has lasted for an incomprehensible 180 million years, seems unshakable, a permanent feature of life on Earth. But 66 million years ago, this world was dealt a mortal blow, not from a terrestrial volcano or a changing climate, but from the depths of space. An asteroid, estimated to be about 10 kilometres in diameter, the size of Mount Everest, was hurtling towards Earth at a speed of over 70,000 kilometres per hour. Its destination the shallow waters of what is now the Yucatan Peninsula in Mexico. The day the sky fell was the single most dramatic and destructive day in the last quarter of a billion years of Earth's history. The impact itself is beyond the scale of human imagination. As the asteroid entered the atmosphere, it would have appeared as a blindingly bright new star, growing in intensity until it outshone the sun. In the final moments, it would have filled the sky. Upon impact, it struck the Earth with the force of 10 billion Hiroshima bombs. The energy released was so immense that the asteroid and a huge volume of the Earth's crust were vaporized in a fraction of a second, creating a crater over 180 kilometers wide and 20 kilometers deep. The immediate effect was a cataclysmic explosion that sent a searing shockwave and a blast of thermal radiation expanding outwards at supersonic speeds. Anything within a radius of hundreds of kilometers, dinosaurs, plants. Everything was instantly incinerated. The impact also triggered mega tsunamis, waves perhaps hundreds of meters high, that raced across the Gulf of Mexico and the Atlantic, scouring coastlines thousands of kilometers away. Earthquakes of a magnitude greater than 11 on the Richter scale would have shaken the entire planet. But the immediate devastation, horrific as it was just the beginning. The truly global catastrophe came from the material that was ejected into the atmosphere. Trillions of tons of pulverized and molten rock were blasted into space, some of it reaching as far as the moon. As this material fell back to Earth, the tiny particles, called spherules, re-entered the atmosphere all over the globe. The friction of their re-entry heated them to incandescence, turning the entire sky into a giant, broiling radiator. For several hours, the surface of the Earth was baked as if it were in an oven. The intense infrared radiation ignited global wildfires, and vast swathes of the planet's forests went up in flames. Any animal that could not find immediate shelter underground or underwater would have been cooked alive. For the survivors who made it through this initial firestorm, a new, longer-lasting horror began. The immense quantities of fine dust, soot from the wildfires, and sulfur aerosols from the vaporized sulfate-rich rocks of the Yucatan platform were thrown high into the stratosphere. This dense cloud of debris spread around the globe, enveloping the planet in a dark, suffocating shroud. The sun was blotted out. This was the beginning of an impact winter, with little to no sunlight reaching the surface. Global temperatures plummeted. Photosynthesis on land and in the oceans shut down almost completely. The plants that had survived the fires began to die in the cold and the dark. The phytoplankton, the microscopic organisms that form the base of the marine food web, died off on a massive scale. The entire global food chain collapsed. The herbivores that had survived the initial impact now starved to death. With the herbivores gone, the carnivores, including the mighty T-Rex, soon followed. The extinction was not a single event, but a cascade of death that unfolded over months and years in the cold, dark world that followed the impact. In the oceans, the collapse of the phytoplankton base wiped out the ammonites, the shelled relatives of squid that had been a major part of marine ecosystems for millions of years. It also doomed the giant marine reptiles, the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs, as air-breathing reptiles at the top of the food chain had no chance once their food supply was gone. In the sky, the giant pterosaurs, also apex predators, vanished forever. In total, about 75% of all species on Earth were wiped out. The victims included every single non-avian dinosaur, an entire, spectacular branch of the Tree of Life, one that had dominated the planet for longer than any other group of large animals, was pruned away in a geological instant. Why did some animals survive while others perished? The pattern of survival is telling. Size was a major factor. No terrestrial animal larger than about 25 kilograms seems to have survived. The small, burrowing mammals, the amphibians that could shelter in freshwater ponds, the turtles, the crocodiles, these were the survivors. Their small size meant they needed less food. Their ability to find shelter underground or in water protected them from the worst of the initial heat blast. And their often generalized, scavenger-like diets allowed them to subsist on the decaying matter, the insects, and the roots that were available in the ruined world. The birds also suffered heavy losses, but some lineages, particularly those with beaks adapted for eating seeds, one of the few food sources that would have remained viable in the devastated landscape, managed to survive. These avian survivors would go on to repopulate the world, evolving into the incredible diversity of birds we see today. They are a living reminder of the dinosaurs' legacy, a direct link to the fearsome theropods of the Mesozoic. Let's pause to consider the alternative. What if that asteroid had missed? What if its trajectory had been slightly different? Or if it had arrived a few minutes earlier or later, plunging into the deep waters of the Pacific instead of the volatile, sulfate-rich shallows of the Yucatan? The dinosaurs would almost certainly have survived. Would they still be here today? It's impossible to say for sure. But they were a highly adaptable group. It's likely they would have continued to evolve and dominate the planet. And what would this have meant for us? The rise of the mammals, and ultimately of humans, was only possible because the dinosaurs were gone. For 100 million years, our mammalian ancestors had lived as small, nocturnal creatures in a world ruled by giants. The extinction event cleared the board, opening up the day and the world to them. Without that catastrophic impact 66 million years ago, it is almost certain that humans would never have evolved. Our entire existence is a consequence of this cosmic accident. The end of the dinosaur story was the beginning of our own. The KP extinction was not just an end, it was the violent, fiery birth of the modern world. The long, spectacular reign of the dinosaurs has come to a fiery end. The dust from the asteroid impact is slowly settling, and the sunlight is returning to a scarred and broken world. We have now crossed a major boundary in Earth's history, leaving the Mesozoic era behind and entering the Cenozoic, the era of new life. This is the era we are still living in today. It is, most famously, the age of mammals. For more than 150 million years, our mammalian ancestors had lived a furtive existence, small, nocturnal creatures scurrying in the shadows of the dinosaurs. The KP extinction event was their liberation. With the great reptiles gone, a planet full of empty ecological niches lay open, a world of opportunity for the small, furry survivors. The Cenozoic is the story of how these humble creatures rose from the ashes of a global catastrophe to become the new rulers of the Earth, diversifying into the incredible array of forms we know today, from whales in the ocean to bats in the air, and eventually to us. The world the mammals inherited was warm and recovering. The early part of the Cenozoic, the Paleogene period, was characterized by a hot, humid, greenhouse climate, much like the Mesozoic. The planet was covered in lush, tropical and subtropical forests that extended from pole to pole. In this verdant world, the mammals began their great evolutionary radiation. Having been restricted to the size of a badger for millions of years, they were now free to grow larger. The first few million years after the extinction saw the rise of a variety of archaic mammal groups. These were evolutionary experiments, the first attempts to fill the roles left vacant by the dinosaurs. There were large, clumsy herbivores and fearsome, carnivorous mammals with primitive teeth. Most of these early groups would eventually be replaced by the more advanced, modern mammal lineages that began to appear, including the ancestors of rodents, primates, and hoofed animals. One of the most remarkable stories of Cenozoic evolution took place in the oceans. With the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs gone, the role of large marine predator was vacant. A group of land-dwelling, hoofed mammals, similar to small deer, began to adapt to a life in the water, likely feeding in shallow coastal estuaries. Over millions of years, this lineage underwent a profound transformation. Their bodies became streamlined, their hind limbs disappeared, their front limbs turned into flippers, and their nostrils migrated to the top of their heads to become a blowhole. These were the first whales. The fossil record of their transition from land to sea, with creatures like Pachytatus and Ambulocetus, is one of the most beautiful and complete examples of macroevolution we have ever discovered. By the later Cenozoic, the oceans were home to giants once again, this time in the form of the great baleen and toothed whales. On land, the mammals grew ever larger, producing a spectacular array of megafauna. In the colder regions of the planet, which began to appear as the global climate started a long cooling trend after the hothouse of the early Cenozoic, woolly mammoths roamed in great herds. These were colossal elephants, covered in thick fur and armed with immense curving tusks. They were closely related to modern elephants, a testament to the success of the proboscidean lineage. In the Americas, one of the most iconic Cenozoic creatures was the giant ground sloth, Megatherium. Far from the small, slow-moving tree dwellers of today, this sloth was the size of an elephant, a massive herbivore that could stand on its hind legs to reach high into the trees, and hunting these giant herbivores were formidable predators. The most famous is Smilodon, the saber-toothed cat. It was a powerfully built predator with huge, knife-like canine teeth, designed for dispatching large, thick-skinned prey. The Cenozoic was not just an age of giants. In South America, which was an isolated island continent for much of the era, a unique fauna evolved, including the terrifying terror birds, or Forus racids. These were giant, flightless, carnivorous birds, some standing over 3 meters tall. That took on the role of apex predator in the absence of large, carnivorous mammals. They were a vivid reminder that the avian dinosaurs had also survived the extinction, and could, under the right circumstances, evolve into fearsome hunters. Australia, another isolated continent, saw the rise of the marsupials, mammals that raised their young in a pouch. This led to the evolution of creatures like Diprotodon, a giant, rhinoceros-sized wombat, the largest marsupial of all time. The world was a menagerie of strange and wonderful mammalian forms, each continent a separate evolutionary experiment. Throughout the Cenozoic, the Earth's climate was on a long, slow, cooling and drying trend. The continents continued to drift towards their modern positions. India collided with Asia, pushing up the immense Himalayan mountain range. The circumpolar current formed around Antarctica as it separated from South America and Australia, isolating the continent and allowing a permanent ice cap to form. This global cooling culminated in the Quaternary period, the most recent chapter of the Cenozoic, which began about 2.6 million years ago. This is the period of the Great Ice Ages. Huge continental ice sheets advanced and retreated over North America and Eurasia in a series of cycles, driven by subtle, periodic changes in the Earth's orbit known as Milankovitch cycles. These ice ages dramatically reshaped the landscape and forced life to adapt to colder, harsher conditions. It was in this challenging, rapidly changing world of the late Cenozoic that a new and particularly clever type of mammal began its own remarkable journey. This story begins in the warm forests of Africa, with a group of mammals that had adapted to a life in the trees, the primates. One of the key primate adaptations was grasping hands and forward-facing eyes, which provided stereoscopic vision, crucial for judging distances when leaping from branch to branch. As the climate cooled and the African forests gave way to open savanna, some of these primates were forced down from the trees and onto the grasslands. This new environment presented a new set of challenges and opportunities. On the open savanna, standing upright on 2 legs, or bipedalism, offered a significant advantage. It allowed for a better view over the tall grass to spot predators, and it freed up the hands for carrying food and, eventually, for making and using tools. This was the crucial first step in the evolution of our own lineage, the hominids. Over millions of years, these bipedal apes evolved, their brains growing larger, their tool use becoming more sophisticated. They learned to control fire, a pivotal moment that provided warmth, protection, and the ability to cook food. They developed the beginnings of complex language. This was the dawn of human consciousness, a new force of nature on the planet. Several species of hominids, like the Neanderthals, spread out of Africa and across the globe, but it was our own species, Homo sapiens, that would ultimately be the sole survivor of this evolutionary journey. We were now on the cusp of a new chapter, not just of the Cenozoic, but of the entire history of the Earth, the age of humans. Our epic journey through deep time has brought us to the final fleeting moments of the geological clock. We have witnessed the birth of a fiery planet, the awakening of life in ancient oceans, the rise and fall of colossal empires of reptiles and mammals. Now, we arrive at the story of a single, peculiar lineage of primate that arose from the changing landscapes of late Cenozoic Africa and went on to inherit the earth. The story of humanity is a story of adaptation, innovation, and a growing power to reshape the planet itself. It is the most recent and perhaps the most consequential chapter in the long history of life. This is our story, woven into the fabric of the Earth's past. The stage for our evolution was set by the great climatic shifts of the Pliocene and Pleistocene epochs. The world was cooling, the ice ages were beginning, and the vast tropical forests of Africa were shrinking, giving way to open woodlands and sprawling savannas. For our arboreal primate ancestors, this was a crisis and an opportunity, forced from the continuous canopy of the forest. They had to adapt to a life on the ground, a dangerous new world stalked by powerful predators. It was in this environment, around 6 to 7 million years ago, that the first crucial step towards humanity was taken bipedalism. Walking upright on 2 legs was a revolutionary adaptation. It was more energy efficient for covering long distances on the savannah. It helped to dissipate heat in the hot African sun, and, critically, it freed the hands. These were no longer just tools for climbing. They were now free to carry food, to care for infants, and, in time, to create. For several million years, a variety of bipedal ape species, the Australopithecines, walked the African plains. The famous fossil Lucy is a prime example. They were small-brained, ape-like creatures, but they walked on 2 legs. They were a bridge between 2 worlds, then around 2. 5 million years ago, a new genus appeared, one that marked a significant leap, Homo. Early members of our genus, like Homo habilis, the handyman, were the first to systematically create and use stone tools. This was a profound cognitive breakthrough. It allowed these early humans to process their food more efficiently, to butcher carcasses scavenged from predator kills, and to access the nutrient-rich marrow inside bones. This higher quality diet, in turn, fueled the growth of the most energy-hungry organ in the body, the brain. A powerful feedback loop was established. Better tools led to better food, which led to bigger brains, which led to even better tools. The next great leap came with Homo erectus, the upright man. This was a taller, more human-like species with a significantly larger brain. They were sophisticated toolmakers, creating beautiful and versatile hand axes, and they were the first hominids to harness the power of fire. The control of fire was a watershed moment in human history. It provided warmth, allowing our ancestors to survive in colder climates. It offered protection from nocturnal predators. It created a social focal point for the group. And it transformed our diet. Cooking food makes it easier to digest and unlocks more nutrients, further fueling our growing brains. Armed with tools and fire, Homo erectus became the first great human explorer, venturing out of Africa and spreading across Asia and Europe. For the first time, a single primate species had a global presence. Over the next million years, human evolution continued in these different parts of the world, leading to the emergence of new species. In Europe and the Middle East, the Neanderthals evolved. They were a highly successful and intelligent species, adapted to the cold climates of the Ice Age. They were skilled hunters, cared for their sick and elderly, and likely had some form of language and symbolic culture. Meanwhile, back in Africa, the crucible of human evolution, our own species, Homo sapiens, emerged around 300,000 years ago. Anatomically, we were modern humans. But for a long time, our behaviour was not so different from that of other hominid species. Then, somewhere around 70,000 years ago, something remarkable happened. A cognitive revolution seems to have occurred, a flowering of creativity, abstract thought, and complex language. This is when we see the first evidence of art, of sophisticated bone tools, of symbolic ornamentation. This was the birth of the human imagination. Armed with this new cognitive toolkit, Homo sapiens began their own great migration out of Africa. This time, the expansion was different. As modern humans spread across the globe, they encountered other human species, like the Neanderthals in Europe and the Denisovans in Asia. The nature of these encounters is still being debated, but genetic evidence shows that there was interbreeding. Many humans today carry small amounts of Neanderthal and Denisovan DNA, a ghostly echo of these ancient meetings. But ultimately, wherever Homo sapiens went, the other human species eventually disappeared, whether through direct conflict, competition for resources, or simply being outreproduced by the technologically and socially advanced newcomers. By about 40,000 years ago, our species was the last human standing. This final phase of our journey brings us to the present day, to the Holocene epoch, the warm, stable period that followed the last ice age. It was in this period that humans made one final revolutionary leap, the invention of agriculture. By learning to domesticate plants and animals, we transitioned from a nomadic, hunter-gatherer lifestyle to a settled, agrarian one. This led to food surpluses, which allowed for the growth of villages, then cities, then civilizations. It led to writing, to mathematics, to art, to science, to, in the geological blink of an eye, we have gone from chipping stones to splitting atoms, from painting on cave walls to sending probes to the outer reaches of the solar system. We have become the dominant force on the planet, a new kind of geological agent capable of altering the climate, the landscape, and the course of life itself. We are, in every sense, a product of the Cenozoic, the inheritors of a world made possible by the fall of the dinosaurs. The story of Earth is long, and tonight we have only walked through some of its chapters, from a molten ball of rock to a world of microbial mats, from the explosion of life in the Cambrian seas to the silent, green forests of the Devonian, from the reign of the mighty dinosaurs to the age of our own ancestors. It has been a journey of unimaginable scale and constant transformation. The planet never sleeps, but you can let the earth keep turning while you rest. If you'd like more journeys like this, you're welcome to return here again.